Thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks for waking me up 20 minutes ago. So today, I would like to focus on a pretty specialized question of market design. When a trade occurs, who should you notify first? The parties to the trade or the public at large? It's a difficult question, and there's some level of consensus. Essentially, the consensus is that if the trade and the market is very illiquid, the trade is very big, then you should notify the parties to the trade first. But if the market is very liquid, there's less consensus, and different markets have decided different things. In particular, NASDAQ is one example, which has decided to disseminate the information to the public at large first before sending it to the parties to the trade. I want to point out that there's one technical solution to disseminate the information to both parties to the trade and to the public at large contemporaneously. And if you're interested in that, come by the booth. It's a bit technical, but it's fun to talk about. Now, what we do at McKay Brothers and Quincy Data is we transport data, or we sell bandwidth for people to transport data. And how do we play in that discussion? So NASDAQ, they control what they do in their data center. They send all the information to everyone in the data center, and this is published to the public at large first. Now, what happens if you want to trade off NASDAQ information on NYSE or on BATS? Then you need to transport that information. So you can buy the NASDAQ raw data product in NYSE or in BATS and receive that. And the question is, do you still have the information at the same time as everyone else? Or can someone else beat you to that all the time? Let's do a little bit of plumbing to try to understand this. So here, the drawing is the pipe, which is the 10 gig pipe that NASDAQ uses to send data to clients inside the data center. And then there's the transport pipe that NASDAQ uses to send data across to MAWA. The little gray thing is a market data packet. So you think that's an Ethernet packet, it comes on the big pipe, and then it will hit either the client or it will hit the switch that will then send it to MAWA. And I will compare two different ways of using a little bit of information which is in red in the market data packet. Either you follow the raw data path or you go for a private signal. So when it hits the switch, on the left side, you will want to fill the small pipe with all the first gray thing in the packet that is of no interest to you. You're waiting for the red thing. And on the right side, you will discard the gray thing and wait for the red thing and send it right away. So you can see that on the left side, you start sending the gray information, and it buffers up. Like the rest doesn't come, and you can't send it yet. On the right side, you've already discarded everything. And if you iterate in time, it's small time, just nanoseconds, but it still counts. You can see that on the red side, you can send the private information first. And in that particular example, the speed difference, the latency difference, is actually almost 1.3 microsecond, which is, believe it or not, essentially infinity if you're a low latency trader. So what are the, so what are the important ingredients of that question? It's the ratio of the delivery pipe inside NASDAQ to the transport pipe to NYSE, and it's also, if you really want to study it, you need to simulate because there's buffering. There are many packets arriving at one time, and you need to have a few assumptions about the processing time that the lowest latency people will have in understanding what are the signals and transmitting the signals and acting on them. Let's look at the mother of all triangles, the mother of all equity trading in the world, the New Jersey Triangle, and really let me focus on the transport layer now and look at back in history, way back when it used to be all fiber, and in 2011 there used to be, I don't know if you can see that well, there's a little bit of white, those are the first registration of wireless networks. So you can go to the FCC website, download the registration, and then you see who is registering and where do they go. So you can see back in 2011 already, there were connections between BATS and NASDAQ, and the point in between BATS and NASDAQ, which is the smaller triangle, was actually the entry point to NYSE. It was the SIFTY pop of Halsey. So if you iterate, 2012, there was a little bit of build-up. Fast forward in history, and then you get to today's the number of registration, which are in the many hundreds, probably over 1,000, and it's extremely congested. And everyone is using the same technology. Essentially, everyone is using a technology which is E-band, and it's a band which is 70 to 80 gigahertz. There's a lot of range susceptibility for that technology, but it's the best available today. Now, if you assume that in those 6 or 7 years, the competition has driven the difference between different networks to almost zero, and that may not be true, but let me just assume that for the discussion, then how does it work? Can NASDAQ retain its property of, after transport, being able to disseminate the data to everyone first? And you guess the answer was no. So the technology today is uniformly E-band. The main providers are ICE. I should have replaced TMX with ICE, SW Network, Apsara, and that should now be PSO, working mostly for NASDAQ, Innova, Tatora, who's a private network, and Spread. Everybody has 1 gigabits per second except Spread, which is 5 gigabits per second, and is serving the corridor NASDAQ to BATS. Now, we're a bit latecomers to that table, and what can we bring? So the thing that we can bring is trying to use a different band. And way back when, in 2013, we wanted to do that, and we actually reserved all the 28 gigahertz band, that's called LMDS, between the data centers. That was a very long-term play, and now it's going to pay out, hopefully in a few months. And this band is very unique. It's the band that's going to be used for 5G cell network. And this is owned statewide, but we got the right to do just a triangle between the exchanges. And it took us about 5 years to develop the right radios to use that band. Now, the question I'd like to ask is, with this band, we can transport about 5 to 7 gigabits worth of data, and that's higher than the 1 gigabit that is traditionally used. So can we really win? And if you transport raw data, the answer is, obviously yes. The serialization of big packets over bigger, fatter pipes is just more efficient. And this is a simulation, because now if you really want to put numbers to that, you need to look at simulations, and that was one day of the NASDAQ FPGA data. And the way to look at the graph is the graph is just the serialization delay to get on the pipe. And the red on the left is what we can do with a 7 gigabit per second network pipe. And on the right is what NASDAQ is doing with a 1 gigabit per second pipe. And of course, there's a big difference, and you can see that the difference varies between a small microsecond to about 3 microseconds. And of course, the most important part of that is in the 2 to 3 microsecond range, because the most important information occurs during bursts. So just by the serialization delay, we have an edge about 2 to 3 microseconds when it really matters. That is assuming zero in the processing layers. Now, if you really want to focus on the important information, you need to simulate something a bit more precisely. So what you need to do is you need to assume what the people doing private signal sending are doing, and that's on the right side of it. Someone is receiving the NASDAQ data at 10 gigabits. They're doing exactly what I showed in my little plumbing thing. They're waiting, they're removing the gray, and they're only sending the red. But it does take a little bit of time to do that. So you need to assume times for that. And on the other side, they're receiving that signal and they're sending a trade. On the left side, NASDAQ is sending the data, and on the receiving end, you do the trading and analyze the data and send the trade. To understand and put numbers to it, we've chosen to focus on what could be signals. And signals, we've restricted to all the trades on the first 100 biggest stocks. So those could be a good proxy for signals. So look at those, and those are the little red things that we want to simulate on transport and see if they arrive the other side faster with a 1 gigabit pipe, or if they arrive faster on the other side with our new offering at 7 gigabits per second. So let me do a little bit of plumbing again. Now the difference is there's a transport for the private signal, which is still at 1 gigabit. We have a fatter transport, which is still not as big as the NASDAQ pipe of 10 gigabits. We have about 7 gigabits. And if you do the same thing, you will see that the red starts being sent a little before on the other side, but the difference between the two now is much smaller. And since it's smaller, the other assumptions about processing time matter a lot. Let's look at reasonable assumptions for that. The reasonable assumptions are, we've taken two cases. Trading is made of a continuum of very different strategies. There are the super low latency strategies with this almost zero processing, and there's the very elaborate AI-intensive strategies with a lot of processing. We've chosen two types of numbers, a fairly low latency strategy with an FPGA type latency, and a software latency, which is a good software latency. So the FPGA latency is not supposed to mean that it's the fastest FPGA available. There are faster FPGA latencies, but that's an FPGA latency where you do a little bit of processing, so it's not the simplest trades. And on the software side, it's a pretty good software, 2 microsecond, but you can still do quite a bit of processing. So if you do that and compare the two paths again, and then you ask the question, who arrives on the other side first, you get to that. So you get to, obviously, if you're looking at the first graph, which is the graph where everything's assumed to be zero, then the private bandwidth wins most of the time, but not all the time. our offer actually wins 1/3 of the time. So even if you assume absolute zero processing latency, which is, you know, a bit less than what you need, because you need something, a few, maybe 100 nanosecond total, then you can see that even in that case, our offer will win 1/3 of the time. If you assume something which is a reasonable FPGA, not the fastest, but a reasonable FPGA, and that's the bottom graph, you can see that our offer would really win 85% of the time. So with a reasonable FPGA, it's already not easy to do that, then you're better off getting the raw data on the other side 85% of the time. And of course, if you're doing software, then you're better off getting the raw data on the other side all the time. So essentially, the message is that I think with what we're bringing to market, we're changing the way people should trade. And we're kind of helping the people that do slightly more elaborate, you know, not very elaborate, but like 2 microsecond or more type trades, because those guys can wait and get the data at reception, and they will not be beat by anyone who does that same kind of elaborate trading, but does it on the other side and then sends the signals. So that is something that I think is material for the mother of all triangles, and this is something that should be coming out in a couple months, and I encourage you to come and ask how you can get involved with this. We have a booth. You're welcome to come.